US and Saudi Arabia also engaging on that earlier this year. But essentially, very important visit. But if I can give an overview of India. Saudi Arabia relationship, it has increased significantly in terms of trade. There are large number of members of the Indian diaspora in Saudi Arabia. And also remember the increased military to military engagement. The service chiefs have been to Saudi Arabia, and also focus for both sides is to make sure how they can work under various multilateral groupings, including, of course, BRICS. We must tell our viewers that earlier this year in Johannesburg, Saudi Arabia became a member as well. There is another council as well, India Saudi Arabia Strategic Council.
से प्रभावित लोगों के प्रति मैं अपनी हार्दिक संवेदना प्रकट करना चाहता हूं। सभी इंजर्ड लोग शीघ्र स्वस्थ हो। इस कठिन समय में पूरा विश्व समुदाय मोरक्को के साथ है और हम उन्हें हर संभव हाइनेसेस, एक्सेलेंसीज, G20 के प्रेसिडेंट के तौर पर भारत आप सभी का हार्दिक स्वागत करता है। इस समय जिस स्थान पर हम एकत्रित हैं, यहां से कुछ ही किलोमीटर के फासले पर लगभग 2500 साल पुराना एक स्तंभ लगा हुआ है। इस स्तंभ पर प्राकृत भाषा में लिखा है, हेवम लोकसा हित मुखेति अथ यम नातिसु हेवम, अर्थात मानवता का कल्याण और सुख सदैव सुनिश्चित किया जाए। 2500 साल पहले भारत की भूमि ने यह संदेश पूरे विश्व को दिया था। आइए इस संदेश को याद कर इस G20 समिट का हम आरंभ करें। 21वीं सदी का यह समय पूरी दुनिया को नई दिशा दिखाने वाला और नई दिशा देने वाला एक महत्वपूर्ण समय है। ये वो समय है जब बरसों पुरानी चुनौतियां हमसे नए समाधान मांग रही हैं और ह्यूमन सेंट्रिक अप्रोच के साथ अपने हर दायित्व को निभाते हुए ही आगे बढ़ना है। फ्रेंड्स, कोविड-19 के बाद विश्व में एक बहुत बड़ा संकट विश्वास के अभाव का आया है। युद्ध ने इस ट्रस्ट डेफिसिट को और गहरा किया है। जब हम कोविड को हरा सकते हैं, विजय प्राप्त कर सकते हैं। आज G20 के प्रेसिडेंट के तौर पर भारत पूरी दुनिया का आह्वान करता है कि हम मिलकर सबसे पहले यह हम सभी के साथ मिलकर चलने का समय है और इसलिए सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, सबका प्रयास का मंत्र हम सभी के लिए एक पथ प्रदर्शक, नॉर्थ और साउथ का डिवाइड हो, ईस्ट और वेस्ट और वाटर सिक्योरिटी हो, वर्तमान के साथ ही आने वाली पीढ़ियों के लिए हमें इन चुनौतियों के समाधान की तरफ बढ़ना ही होगा। फ्रेंड्स, भारत की G20 प्रेसिडेंसी का प्रतीक बन गई है। भारत में ये पीपल्स G20 बन गया। करोड़ों भारतीय इससे जुड़े। देश के 60 से ज्यादा शहरों में 200 से ज्यादा अधिक बैठकें दी जाए। विश्वास है कि इस प्रस्ताव पर हम सबकी सहमति है। आप सबकी सहमति से आगे की कार्रवाई शुरू करने से पहले मैं अफ्रीकन यूनियन के अध्यक्ष को इसके साथ ही मैं मीडिया के साथियों से भी विनम्र आग्रह करूंगा कि वे अब हमें समय दें और इस सभागृह से बाहर जाने का कष्ट करें।
All right, there you have it, viewers. The Indian Prime Minister has announced and has invited African Union to join the G20 as a permanent member. There was a lot of talk around this, and the Prime Minister announced it, looked across the room for approval, and with the bang of the hammer, there was a warm hug with the African Union leader to ensure and to commemorate, solidify its place in the G20 bloc. India has successfully bridged this gap that the African Union had with the G20 bloc, and now it will be there as a permanent member. A lot has been spoken by the Prime Minister just in the past few minutes, just as the G20 bloc is heading into the first session. There, of course, we have your visuals of the Indian Prime Minister addressing all world leaders who have made their way, and he started off his quick speech offering condolences and best wishes for the earthquake victims of in Morocco. There have been nearly 300 deaths in Morocco due to the earthquake, and India has offered all help and its condolences for the same. India offers a warm welcome to all world leaders as they're heading into the first session of the G20. And the Indian Prime Minister also mentioned in the beginning of his speech that just a few kilometers from the location where they are all located at the moment, the Bharat Mandapam, he mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old Stamba pillar which has a sunset. He mentioned that there is a 2,500-year-old stump, pillar, which has a Sanskrit
presentation from the Chinese as well. And in next 48 hours, the developments in New Delhi will be closely watched across the four corners of the world.
Key takeaway here, the Indian Prime Minister spoke about a global trust deficit. He first gave a mention of COVID-19 and how we as a global community have overcome that. And then he also spoke about a lack of trust owing to the war. And, of course, it's a loose mention regarding, we of course know which war he's talking about. And he said that there is distrust in the world and the war has only furthered that ever since the COVID-19. But if we can defeat COVID, we can win over mistrust as well. So essentially, mistrust is what he's talking about. Talk to us about the global trust deficit and how the G20 bloc is going to essentially get over that. The Indian Prime Minister, these are some of the first words he has spoken, and it has touched upon the key issue which mostly all world leaders and the entire world was hoping to hear from India. Siddhant, are you able to hear me? All right.
Well, yes, I can hear you. Essentially, what the Indian Prime Minister talked about was how the trust deficit needs to be bridged. And here in Delhi, the focus will be to form consensus when it comes to the various warring fractions, whether it's the West versus the Russians, or, of course, there has been opposition as well when it comes to the Chinese in terms of various Indian initiatives. But largely, if I can give a recall of the usage of trust deficit in the past by the Indian side. Now, we know that the Indian side during the conflict last year, when the leaders of the Indian Indian Prime Minister and the Russian President met, the Indian Prime Minister gave a famous comment. He said that this is not an era of war, and since then that comment really got focus across the world. It was part of the Bali joint statement as well. Will that comment be part of this joint statement is something that will be closely watched. But all in all, whether it's the trust deficit, whether it is the North-South.
Yes, and I'm just struck by how we're seeing, the evolution of so many different new alliances. We've come into this G20 with much more close relations between Korea and Japan, for example. But I'm also wondering about what your take is, Professor, concerning the possible dilution of the effectiveness of G20 with so many additional members. On the one hand, there's the upside of having more representation, but on the other, we're already seeing so much difficulty reaching consensus on something like the war in Ukraine.
Yep, so that's certainly correct, but I think it's helpful to also focus on some of the positives here. Now, the Chinese leadership has obviously decided not to give India's G20 summit its full support, but that can be an opportunity for others. And I've been very interested to see some of the meetings that have either already taken place or being planned, such as that between Prime Minister Modi and Joe Biden. Also, I'm originally from the UK, and so interested in the opportunities for UK-India relations as well. So whilst others might not really be giving their full support to this organization, it is an opportunity for others to make use of the summit and really cement closer ties between the countries.
All right. Thanks, James. And now I'd like to cut across to our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who's on ground at Bharat Mandapam. Now, Siddhant, give us a brief about what all's happened there on ground while you've been there. You're seeing the action happen right in front of you. All the world leaders arriving one by one. We can make out from the visuals that we're getting. Talk to us more about what's all the action happening on there.
Well, what's interesting is how they are being welcomed by the Indian Prime Minister. There have been few moments of conversation as well. From what we can see from the visuals, it looked like the German Chancellor talked about his eye injury, how the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was welcomed by the Indian Prime Minister, both first doing a namaste and a warm hug as well. In fact, the Indian Prime Minister gave warm hug to two leaders with the UAE President as well. But these are body languages which we can can interpret and see the warmth in the relationship. We can also see some cold handshakes as well. I'll not like to name those countries, but essentially the fact that the leaders have come here shows the focus here in Delhi, and also kudos to the Indian diplomacy in making sure that this event is underway, and of course the world leaders have managed to come despite their very very busy schedule.
I did notice, of course, you are noticing everyone's body language very closely. And I think that there is a little bit of fun in that, of course, reading a little beyond the lines in terms of how the different leaders have been greeted. Talk to us more about the warm hugs and the cold handshakes.
Well, I'll talk about the warm hugs first. UAE and with the UK Prime Minister, and we will see these warm hugs soon, perhaps with the American President, with the Saudi Crown Prince who just arrived earlier today, and of course a few conversations as well. I believe that the Italian Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister cracked some kind of joke because they had a good laugh in front of all the cameras there. But essentially, they were leaders from Turkey, from Canada. But the fact that they are here in Delhi showcases their commitment to multilateralism and G20 being held in Delhi, and provides an opportunity for these leaders to engage with the Indian counterpart. When it comes to Turkey, we know the relationship hasn't been doing very well, but we have seen a change in stance of Turkey in many senses. Turkey has not been very vocal on Kashmir in past few years. In at least last 1 year, I haven't seen many vocal comments. With the Canadians, of course, there are thorny issues, but both sides do see potential as well. Trade is something, but of course, there's a pause on the trading relationship. Let's see how the relationship goes. But India-Canada relationship in the past have seen a lot of positivity as well, and there will be a pull aside as well here in Delhi. So will that pull aside lead to a wider positivity in the relationship is something that will be closely watched.
Siddhant, do we know anything else about possible bilaterals with Prime Minister Modi and some of the other Southeast Asian nations like Joko Widodo, the Prime Minister of Indonesia, we're seeing there?
Well, one thing I can say about Indonesia, since you mentioned Indonesia, the Indian Prime Minister was in Indonesia just this week. In fact, he was in Indonesia on Thursday. He arrived on Thursday back. He was there for the ASEAN meetings, the India-ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit. And this was the Indian Prime Minister's second visit to Indonesia in just last 1 year. That shows the engagement between India and Indonesia. In fact, they're planning a connectivity project as well that connects India's Andaman Islands to Aceh province in Indonesia. In fact, India and Indonesia are maritime neighbors, something that many might not be talking about because our focus is usually the geographical land neighbors. But focus is also on the cultural connectivity. Bali, we were there last year for the G20 summit. This is a Hindu island, and of course, there are a lot of similarities between the culture of India and Bali. So, a lot of commonalities between India and Indonesia, but larger Southeast Asian country as well. I can point out to how the Indian Prime Minister welcomed the Singaporean Prime Minister as well, who is a special invitee during this year's G20 summit.
Thanks, Siddhant. Stay with us. I'd just like to come back to our guest, James. James, now, India-ASEAN ties have definitely been on the rise, but, I have to mention here that Xi Jinping was missing at the recently concluded ASEAN summit. How much do you feel the multilateral reforms here at G20 could, I won't say undermine, but kind of override the BRI initiative, the Belt and Road initiative for China? And do you think China is a little insecure about that, Jessica? And we have been discussing this since the morning. And talk to us more about it.
Yeah, so I see Xi Jinping's non-attendance as really a key turning point. Up until this point, it seemed to be open to debate whether China would continue to play a full role within existing multilateral structures, or would really turn its back on them and try and build structures that it feels that it can dominate. I think we have an answer to that question now. With the decision not to attend, it really seems that China has decided it wants to move away from these existing organizations. It wants to undermine them and instead to build its own competing structures.
It's really remarkable because it's benefited so very much from these multilateral organizations, the World Trade Organization in particular. Are you struck by that?
Yeah, and indeed, I'm quite worried about it. That I think it's a big strategic mistake. It seems to be a decision guided by the personal pride of Xi Jinping rather than China's own kind of strategic or economic interests. And when countries begin to make mistakes like that, it makes you wonder what other errors could they make.
I mean, we're already seeing assessments that Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, telling China, look, we don't have American companies that want to invest in China anymore because of the policies that you're putting out. I can imagine that's the same in India as well. Even besides the strategic tensions, there's a lack of desire to invest when you don't have a multilateral forum where everybody can come to the table and talk it out.
Yeah. And I think that, unfortunately, this is what we often see with authoritarian governments. When one leader who has amassed so much power, who has been in the position for so long, they're no longer getting such good advice. It happens so often that they end up being surrounded by advisors who just tell them what they want to hear. And that's where you get these own goals being scored.
Recommend then for countries that are so reliant? I mean, China is a critical part of the global economy. You can't really decouple thoroughly. And that's an argument everyone's having.
Exactly. The
Everybody's
US is
struggling
made it
with
clear
that.
we don't want to decouple, we want to de-link in a manner and kind of just distance.
But even that is difficult. That's the struggle that all these countries are facing now, isn't it?
In 2022, I think the trade between China and US, it had surged. So they can't really kind of just disconnect completely. So how do you draw a line here? I mean, talk to us about that, James.
Yeah, this is something which is very prominent in discussions within Japan, which is that China is seen as the biggest security threat to Japan, but it's also the most important economic partner. So you sometimes still have politicians within the United States talking about decoupling. But in Japan, there's a very clear recognition that is simply impossible. And so the argument which is made from Japanese leaders is, despite the difficulties, engagement politically with
And it is the weekend of diplomacy right here in India's national capital, New Delhi. To talk further on the G20 summit and the bilaterals that will be taking place today, we have our correspondents fanned across the G20 summit venue, the Bharat Mandapam. We have with us principal diplomatic correspondents, Dhant Sibal. We also have with us our correspondents, Molly Gambhir and Bhairavi Singh. We're also being joined by Dr. Robert Edwin Kelly, who's an American political analyst. And we also have with us Bharashwati Mukherjee, who's a former diplomat. In the course of next few minutes on the show today, we will delve upon what is going to happen at the G20 summit. But first, let's see what's making news at the Bharat Mandapam. Well, the high-octane G20 summit has kicked off. Several world leaders have gathered